And thank you for this amazing opportunity to present here today. I really wish I could be there and see everyone, but I'm really happy to have this opportunity still. And as you said, I've titled this presentation Navigating Research in the Arctic. It's not going to be about my research so much and the results from that research. It's going to be about the experiences I've had doing this research that I do in the Arctic and some considerations for that and how I think we can all navigate the research that we do in the Arctic. I'm going to start off by just introducing myself a little further. My name is Aviaja Lyberth Hauptmann, and I have a bachelor and master's degree in biology from the University of Copenhagen. I focused in my studies on biotechnology and applied microbiology. And after finishing my master's degree, I went for a PhD at the Technical University of Denmark, where I had an opportunity to work with microbial metagenomics, so the microbial communities in the Arctic cryosphere, so and ice environments. After finishing my PhD, I wanted to use these tools of microbial metagenomics, but working with something that was a little bit closer to people than the cryosphere is. So for the past 3 years, I've been doing postdoc research on the microbiomes of Inuit foods. And this is also part of who I am. I was born and raised in Greenland. I'm Inuit. And the one photo on the left-hand side here is my family on our annual hunting trip at Aviaja. Aviaja is a heritage hunting site in Greenland where my family has gone since the early 50s and have come back each year to do our hunting for caribou and muskox. The second photo on the right-hand side is 30 years after the other photo taken. The older photo is from when I was 1 year old, and the second one, I was 31. I came back to Greenland and had the opportunity to bring my research project to our annual hunting trip, looking at what microbes are connected to the act of hunting and eating foods from hunting activities. But I didn't just bring my research into my family. I brought my family into my research. And this is a very important point in this talk, is in everything that I do with my research, I bring myself as a human being, being from Greenland, also being from Denmark, and everything that I am is part of the research that I do. And I feel this is one of the things that's most important when you work with communities and work with Arctic research, is that you bring yourself as a human being. And I will get back to that throughout this talk. So what is it actually that I research? I do want to make a short comment about that. So right now, my focus is on fermented foods of the Arctic. The Arctic diet is animal sourced, so our fermented foods are also animal sourced. This is one of the things that I've had an opportunity to look into, and this is a fermenting walrus. You might be able to see a walrus flipper here and a skull here and some walrus lying here. And I do realize that this is a very strong image, but this is on purpose that I'm bringing this image to this talk, because I think the image is a good illustration of the fact that things can be very difficult for us to understand. Not everyone will understand this food. I certainly struggled with it a little bit because this is not something that I grew up with. This fermenting walrus is from Northern Greenland. I'm not from Northern Greenland. So I had never seen this before. And as a microbiologist, it was very exciting. As a human being, as a Greenlander, it was very exciting. But I understand that some people might struggle with really perceiving this as food. And this is part of what we need to acknowledge when we work in environments that are not familiar to us. The reason that I was in Northern Greenland was because I wanted to research this particular food. This is kiviak, and kiviak are seabirds that are sewn into a seal skin and then left to age for it can be several months, up to a year, and then they're eaten after that period of aging. And I was going to northern Greenland to research this Keynote, and I was really looking forward to it because this is one of the Greenlandic fermented foods that have become quite famous. And if you Google it, you will find something like this, for instance. Keynote, probably the world's most disgusting meat dish. And it's a well-written piece and there's a lot of humor in it, but I hope you will also understand that this is quite offensive, talking about a food that's very important to some people and a food that's disappearing because fewer and fewer people know how to make it. So this again just illustrates the fact that not everyone will understand these kinds of foods. And this leads me to tell you a story about this lady here. Bachelor lives in Siorapaluk, in the northernmost permanently populated place on Earth. It's northern Greenland, and this is where I went to see the making of the Keynote. And on my way there, it's a very long travel. At the time I was living in Nuuk, so I was living in Greenland, but it's still a really long travel. And on my way, I had the opportunity to give a radio interview, and the radio hosts were announcing that in a second, we'll be talking to Aviaja, and she's on her way to Siorapaluk to do research on Keynote. And when the radio host said this, Bachelor became very angry. She was angry that this stranger that I am, I had never been to Siorapaluk before. I do not know any of the 50 or so people who live there. So I'm very much a stranger to that place, that I was coming in to tell them probably that their foods are dangerous. And they can be, historically they have been, but that's not the focus of my research. What I want to understand with the research that I do is how they are healthy, how they have been pieces in surviving in Arctic, what role they play in an animal source diet. And lucky for me, Bachelor listened to the interview and she heard me talk about these things. And eventually her and her family showed up at the airport when we arrived to Siorapaluk and welcomed us into their family and eventually showed us how to make the Keynote. So I am, of course, very grateful to her, and I'm also happy that I didn't come there to investigate how dangerous Keynote is, because I would have really crossed some boundaries there. So the fact that fermented foods can be important to health is something that's pretty well established by now. For the past decades, 2-3 decades, we've gotten this including that human beings have microbial ecosystems inside of us, and they are very important to health. We have microbes and viruses and fungi living in our stomachs, for instance, and fermented foods having a lot of microbes in them do have a potential to play together with our intestinal microbes and have a positive effect on our health. And this is also part of the research that I do. I have a research project that has been running in northern Greenland as well for over a year about our gut microbiomes in Greenland and the dynamics in our gut microbiomes. And again, I do not want to talk about the research itself, but I learned a lot from going to northern Greenland. And one of the things was that I came across this booklet. I was sitting one day at the healthcare center in Qaanaaq in northern Greenland. Qaanaaq is a community of between 500 and 600 people, and they have a healthcare facility there, and they were helping me a lot with this research. And I came across this booklet, which is a booklet that tells parents and schools what they should give children to make sure that their children have a good day. And on the left-hand side is how the page in the booklet looks like. And on the right-hand side, I've translated that into English. There are a few things that we might notice about the table. One thing is that by far most of the foods on the table are imported foods, not native to Greenland. seal is native to Greenland and dried fish are native to Greenland. So those are the local foods that are part of this table. And in Greenland, we have this diet recommendation situation that we mostly recommend imported foods as part of our diet recommendations. And some of those foods like cucumbers or bananas and carrots, all mentioned in this table, can be very difficult for families in Ghana to get their hands on because they're not abundant there, and when they are, they're very expensive. But that's not actually what I want you to notice about the table. What's important for now is to notice that there are a few servings of skimmed milk, 3 to be exact. And the booklet says calcium is the most important supplier. Milk is the most important supplier of calcium. And that's true for many regions. But the problem is in Greenland, both among children and adults, about 50% of the population are lactose intolerant. So we are recommending this food item that isn't actually healthy for about half of the population. And that had me really thinking a lot about what is the context of the research that I do, because when I look at the gut microbiome of our peoples in Greenland, how that interplays with our diet, what are the questions that I should be asking? And what is the food situation that this gut microbiome is situated in? And one thing that really struck me is that this booklet really had this emphasis on milk, because in Greenland, we do have foods that are very high in calcium. You will see this plate here, which is very typical traditional Greenlandic foods plate. You have the capel in the middle. It's the dried fish. We call it a ammersek. And the ammersek is eaten whole, including its bones. And the table on the left-hand side says that the amount of calcium milligrams per 100 grams of fish is about 1100. That's very high. It's almost 10 times as high for the same weight of milk. So we've overlooked this excellent source of calcium and instead recommended our children to drink milk, to which half of them are intolerant. And this really is something that has been a lot on my mind, and I've come across it several times. I have a friend who has a condition with her blood. So sometimes she lacks iron and she needs to eat foods with high content of iron. So her doctor calls her and tells her, you should eat more meat, particularly beef. And then this friend of mine, she asked, can I eat Greenlandic foods instead, as we call it, because Greenlandic foods are meats and organs. But the doctor says, because the doctor didn't know that much about traditional Greenlandic foods, it would be better for her just to eat beef. And this is actually a great shame, because there's a lot of research into the nutrient contents of our traditional foods like caribou and seal. And these are very high in nutrients. Also, when compared to imported foods like beef, there's much more iron and other nutrients in the wild animals that can be eaten from a local diet than compared to factory farmed meats. So because the doctor doesn't know a lot about traditional Greenlandic foods, the person ends up recommending something that isn't optimal. And this isn't just a coincidence. People in Greenland do know that our foods are healthy. In 1995, the Public Health Survey in Greenland asked people whether they believed that Greenlandic foods were healthy. And 93% of the Greenlanders that were asked said that the foods were not just important to health, but very important to health. And about a third, or 2% of the Danes that lived in Greenland are somehow familiar with Greenlandic foods, believed the same way that the foods were healthy. So this sort of brings me back to Basha, because it makes sense that she was wary of me coming there. The food situation that a lot of people in Greenland have shows them that outsiders do not always understand their foods. And this leads to choices in the healthcare system, in our diet recommendations that aren't optimal and aren't based on what the people believe is the right thing to eat. So I can understand that Bachelor was a little bit sort of hesitant to let me in and investigate her food. And the big point here is that it matters who you are when you do your research. And it matters because who we are, the perspectives that we bring impacts the stories we tell. And to me, researching is also storytelling. From the moment where you are trying to convince a funding agency to fund you, and you are telling them just, this is so important because of this and this. This is the greatest project that will ever be, and I need a lot of money, to the very final part where you disseminate your results in a scientific journal, for instance. You are telling stories about the data. And the stories we tell, and not the least the questions we ask about the data, are influenced by who we are. And this doesn't mean that you need to be from Greenland to do research in Greenland, not at all. What I believe is that we just need some tools to work with this, and we need to acknowledge this, and we need to be open about it. So if we think about research as storytelling, there are Indigenous scholars who have made these excellent storywork principles that can guide us to navigate our research. And there are these 7 principles that I would like to go through. And I will start with going through the last 3 of them that are holism, interrelatedness, and synergy. These 3 concepts relate to how we try to understand our data. Our data exist not on their own. When we measure something, and this is particularly important in the natural sciences, we are well trained to keep factors constant, to reduce down to one single entity that we can measure. So we are trained in looking away from the interrelatedness of things. We are looking away from the holistic context that what we work with exist in. But it's important to bring this in. Interrelatedness, just to give an example, if you are fascinated by contamination cycles on our planet and you're looking into how persistent organic pollutants are deposited in snow and ice environments, or how mercury is deposited, and you measure that and you create data around that. This data is interrelated with contaminants in our food systems. They're interrelated, therefore, also with the stories that are connected to our foods and which foods are prioritized in a diet recommendation situation, for instance. So this is how something that might not seem like it's important for people's daily choices and health in food is very connected to that. And for the people who live in the Arctic, every animal, every piece of information that you draw from the environment, physical, chemical, or biological, is part of a whole of their lives. And this is something we all have to remember. And I do think that most people understand this and understand that if they can see how things are interrelated, they will be able to create a synergy around their research, around what the activities that they're doing. And I believe that this is also part of the reason that incorporation of Indigenous knowledge in research has become very popular. And I want to connect a remark to this concept of Indigenous knowledge, because I do see a lot of research projects and well-meaning, amazing people who want to make sure that their research is done and appropriately, who use this tool of Indigenous knowledge. But the way that it is done, if it's done only as a tool, if you take Indigenous knowledge and use it as a tool for research, rather than trying to position your research within the frame of the larger Indigenous knowledge, you haven't really changed much. So what I hope is that we can expand this concept of Indigenous knowledge towards a concept of Indigenous understanding, because as a researcher, it is easier to go in and sample someone's Indigenous knowledge. You can ask an Indigenous knowledgeable person questions and you can note down on paper their knowledge. But sampling Indigenous understanding, as I hope you can see, isn't as easy. To get a grasp of someone's understanding, it requires a lot more from you. It requires of you that you build a relationship, that you spend time, that you are open towards a greater understanding required than just knowledge. And I hope this makes sense. It makes a lot of sense for me. So this is just a remark connected to the concept of Indigenous knowledge. Also, using the concept of Indigenous understanding lets us see that not just anyone can obtain this. To understand something, you need to be the right kind of person. And again, this doesn't mean you have to be an Indigenous person. It just means that you have to make more effort. So the last four of the storyboard principles are respect, responsibility, reverence, and reciprocity. And I know and believe, and I'm convinced that all of us go into the research that we do with respect. So I'm just going to move past that a little bit quickly. But responsibility, for each project, what responsibility means is different. For myself, where I think about my responsibility the most is in my research, for instance, with the gut microbiome project. I feel a very great deal of responsibility towards the people who went into this project with me, the participant who delivered an actual piece of their bodies for my research. I feel great responsibility to keep them updated, to be grateful to them, but also to make sure that downstream of what I do, the knowledge that is generated from their bodies is something that I feel confident about returning to them, that I do not create research that they will not be happy about. That is a great sense of responsibility that I feel towards them. And in this same way, it's important for me to note that there are many researchers in the Arctic. We create a lot of knowledge, a lot of facts, a lot of data. But once a fact has been established, it can't really be taken away. That is just how it is. So we have to take responsibility for the knowledge we create. Once the knowledge is there, we can't look away from it. And we have to take responsibility for the downstream impacts that that knowledge has. Reverence, I understand this as a much deeper sense of respect. I think that we can all, if we want to, we can respect anyone, even people we don't really like. But reverence is something you feel towards a person when you feel a deep sense of gratitude or a deep sense of respect for that person on a much more personal and deep level. And I feel that this is needed this is how we need to go into our collaborations for them to be equitable. We have to understand that the people we work with are equal to us in every sense of our lives. And then finally, there's the concept of reciprocity, to give as much as you get. And what you can give are many things. It can be to pay people for their time, for the time that they spent doing an interview, for that sample that they delivered to you, for showing you the way somewhere. That is one part of reciprocity. But another part that I think is very important as well is that you give as much as of your person, of your private self in the relationships that you have in your Arctic research as is given to you. So again, this idea of bringing yourself as a person. So this is sort of my final conclusion around this. I think that when we want to navigate our research, we have to openly acknowledge that we are not objective. We do bring our personal perspectives, conscious and subconscious, into the stories that we tell. And I think it's also important that we are honest to ourselves as well as to those around us, that we do gain something personally from our research. Sometimes people that we meet who are not researchers look upon researchers as some sort of superheroes coming to solve a problem. And this is something that we are trained in thinking, because this is what we also have to convince, again, the funding agencies about, that we are going to come with our magnificent academic knowledge and solve problems. But we are also there to get our PhDs, to get our publications, to be able to work with our hobbies, which a lot of us are doing. And we have to be honest to ourselves about that, that we gain something personally from doing our research. And then again, just reiterating this concept of bringing ourselves as persons, and close that off. This is me sampling fermenting walrus in northern Greenland with my 1-year-old son on my back. And I do really try, both consciously and subconsciously, it's something that I do. I bring myself as a person when I do research also, because it is my hobby and I feel very privileged to be doing it. But this particular trip, I think I went beyond what I would usually do in bringing myself, because I had to bring my son. He couldn't be away from his mom yet. He just turned 1. So he was with me all the way. And that made me very vulnerable, because sometimes he was crying at the worst possible times. He was crying and he was hungry or he needed to be changed. But that also made me be there as the person that I am, as the mother that I am. And that gave me really the most incredible experience that I've ever had going there and doing this research. So as a very, very final note, I think also if you do that, if you do bring yourselves as human beings into the research, you will not have a problem navigating, because you will connect to the people who are there and you will be able to sense when things are not right or what they want out of the research. So I think I actually have no doubt that everyone doing research in the new generation of researchers will be able to do this. We've seen a lot of change in the past year even, about acknowledging other perspectives, whether or not it's women's perspectives or people of color. So I feel very confident that the future of Arctic research is going to be quite a lot different than the past of research. But it's also important to note that some of the structures that we work with, like funding agencies, I've mentioned them a few times, or the established scientific community, are shaped through many, many years of research and might not be changeable just overnight to allow people to bring themselves. But I think if we really follow our intuition and we keep working as researchers with our conscious with us all the time, these things will change with time. So I am very ready and hopeful that you have some comments or questions for this. I am very grateful to have had this opportunity to talk, and I hope that some of the points at least resonated with you. And you can find me, you're welcome to write me an email at any time, or find me on social media. Thank you for listening.